In the year 367, when the young Gratian became emperor, the Roman imperial institution had already existed for centuries. The position of emperor was not simply a political office, but a complex system of power, symbolism, and expectation that had developed over a long historical process. To understand how child emperors could later ascend the throne, it is necessary first to examine the nature of the imperial role itself and how it had evolved by the late 4th century. Earlier generations had established many expectations about what a Roman ruler should be. But by this period, the office had changed significantly, shaped by new political realities and the growing influence of Christianity. A range of contemporary sources reveals the qualities, duties, and public image expected of a late Roman emperor, showing both the ideals associated with the position and the practical demands of ruling an empire. One important guide to the ideal image of imperial rule was a rhetorical work written in the late 3rd century that explained how rulers should be praised in formal speeches. This text outlined the virtues and characteristics expected of an emperor and provided a structured model for describing the qualities of a successful ruler. Although no emperor could perfectly match this ideal description, the framework helps reveal how imperial authority was understood and represented. Over time, the office continued to develop, eventually reaching a stage where even a very young child could theoretically occupy the throne. At the same time, the adoption of Christianity introduced new religious expectations for emperors, adding spiritual responsibilities to the traditional political and military duties. These changes show that the imperial role was not fixed, but constantly evolving in response to shifting social and ideological conditions. Public speeches praising emperors also provide valuable insight into how rulers were presented to their subjects. Collections of ceremonial orations delivered across several centuries demonstrate how speakers celebrated imperial virtues and reinforced political legitimacy. These speeches followed established traditions of praise that had existed long before the Roman Empire itself, drawing on a shared language of honor and authority. They often highlighted similar qualities such as strength, wisdom, justice, and divine favor, helping to create a consistent image of what an ideal emperor should represent. Such speeches also reveal how rulers wished to be perceived and how their supporters promoted their authority. The true purpose of these ceremonial speeches has long been debated. Some have suggested that they were intended to guide emperors by describing the qualities they should aspire to achieve. Others view them as little more than exaggerated flattery designed to win favor or reward. Another interpretation sees them as a form of political communication, carefully presenting the emperor's image to the public in a way that reinforced his legitimacy. These speeches were often delivered during important public events such as an emperor's accession, arrival in a city, or assumption of office, where the spectacle and ceremony were as significant as the words themselves. Because of their highly celebratory nature, such speeches must be treated carefully when used as historical evidence. They frequently exaggerate achievements and attribute virtues that may not have existed in reality. Nevertheless, they remain valuable because they reveal how emperors were officially portrayed and what qualities were considered desirable in a ruler. Even if the praise was excessive, it still reflects the expectations and ideals surrounding imperial power. The audience for these speeches was relatively limited, consisting mainly of political and military elites, yet this group was crucial since their support was essential for maintaining authority. Furthermore, the messages conveyed in these speeches often appeared in other forms of imperial communication, such as laws and coin inscriptions, spreading similar ideas throughout the empire. Other writings from the period offer a different perspective on imperial rule. Historical accounts sometimes provide more direct and critical evaluations of emperors, describing how rulers actually behaved and whether they fulfilled their expected roles. These works demonstrate that the idealized image presented in public praise did not always correspond to reality. They also show the gap that often existed between the official portrayal of the emperor and the practical challenges of governing a vast and diverse empire. Religious writings introduced yet another dimension to the understanding of imperial authority. With the spread of Christianity, the emperor increasingly came to be viewed as a ruler chosen by divine will, responsible for maintaining order and harmony in the earthly realm under God's guidance. This new vision transformed traditional imperial ideology by adding spiritual leadership to the emperor's responsibilities. The ruler was no longer simply a military commander or political leader, but also a figure with a sacred role, expected to uphold religious truth and moral order. This development significantly shaped the expectations placed upon emperors in the later Roman world. Taken together, these different sources reveal the wide range of qualities expected of an ideal emperor. They describe not only political and military competence, but also moral character, education, and personal virtue. Although few rulers could ever meet all these expectations, the ideal itself played an important role in shaping how imperial authority was understood and presented. Among the personal qualities expected of an emperor, family background and origins were considered important. A distinguished homeland or noble ancestry could enhance a ruler's prestige, while stories of divine signs at birth suggested that his rule had been favoured by higher powers. Physical appearance also carried symbolic meaning. Descriptions of emperors often emphasized strength, beauty, and commanding presence, presenting the ruler's body as a visible reflection of his authority and dignity. Such portrayals helped reinforce the image of the emperor as a figure set apart from ordinary people. Accounts of several rulers from this period illustrate these ideals. Descriptions of emperors frequently emphasize their impressive physical features, portraying them as strong, majestic, and commanding figures whose appearance inspired respect. Their native lands were praised for shaping their character, teaching endurance, discipline, and resilience. In some cases, imperial families were even said to possess divine origins, further strengthening claims to authority. The achievements of an emperor's father were often highlighted as evidence of inherited virtue, while the emperor's own appearance and presence were presented as sources of reassurance and stability for the population. Education formed another essential element of the ideal ruler's character. Intellectual ability, love of learning, and mastery of various disciplines were all considered signs of excellence. A ruler was expected to demonstrate knowledge of literature, philosophy, languages, or military science, depending on his talents. Historical accounts frequently comment on the education of emperors, praising those who pursued knowledge eagerly and criticizing those who lacked intellectual refinement. Some rulers were admired for their skill in writing, painting, or other arts, while others were described as lacking proper training or cultural sophistication. Family origin, ancestry, early upbringing, and education all played an important role in shaping how an emperor was presented to the public. Ideally, a ruler was expected to possess an honourable background and a distinguished formation, although shortcomings in these areas could sometimes be ignored or softened in public representation. More important, however, were the emperor's actions. His conduct could not be concealed or overlooked, because it formed the true measure of imperial character. Public praise focused on achievements, which were traditionally divided into deeds performed in peace and those carried out in war. These actions were expected to reflect four essential virtues: courage, justice, self-control, and wisdom. This set of moral qualities had deep roots in earlier traditions of kingship and continued to shape expectations of imperial behaviour. The practice of evaluating rulers according to their virtues and faults was well established. Historical writers frequently assessed emperors by comparing their conduct with that of earlier rulers, creating a moral framework through which contemporary audiences could judge imperial leadership. Such comparisons reminded readers that there existed recognized standards of behavior, both admirable and shameful, which emperors were expected to follow. This approach reflected a belief that knowledge of past actions could guide present conduct, reinforcing the idea that moral continuity linked earlier generations to the present. Members of the Roman elite were educated within this tradition, absorbing values that emphasized ethical conduct and the importance of virtuous leadership. For an emperor, embodying these traditional virtues was essential. Personal character could carry as much weight as political legitimacy, and for many subjects it mattered less how a ruler gained power than whether he possessed the qualities necessary to govern effectively. Imperial authority rested partly on a form of personal prestige, grounded in the belief that the emperor possessed exceptional abilities beyond those of ordinary individuals. This perception of extraordinary capacity helped sustain loyalty and justified the emperor's elevated position. Among the four central virtues, courage occupied the foremost place. It was demonstrated primarily through military leadership and success in warfare. In descriptions of war, emphasis was placed on the emperor's ability to outmaneuver his enemies, anticipate their strategies, and secure victory through superior planning. His own campaigns were portrayed as displays of skill, knowledge, and determination. Warfare was an unavoidable reality of Roman political life, and military concerns dominated the responsibilities of the state. The empire depended heavily on its capacity to wage war, and therefore military competence became one of the defining qualities of imperial rule. The emperor's role in warfare could take many forms. He might personally command troops in battle, inspire soldiers through speeches, organize military logistics, or consult with generals on strategic decisions. Even in victory, he was expected to show restraint and humanity toward defeated enemies. Although not every ruler personally led armies into combat, he still needed to ensure the effectiveness of the military by providing adequate supplies, equipment, and strategic direction. Above all, he had to maintain the loyalty of his soldiers and commanders. Securing the support of the army was essential for stability, and the distribution of honours and rewards to military leaders served as an important means of preserving their allegiance. This need for military loyalty would later present serious challenges, especially for emperors who ascended the throne as children. Descriptions of individual rulers often highlight their military qualities. Some were praised for their physical strength, skill with weapons, and dedication to military training. Others gained recognition for careful planning in battle and personal bravery that inspired their troops. At times, however, excessive boldness could prove dangerous, leading to reckless decisions or even death in combat. Certain emperors were admired for their discipline, foresight, and experience, though they were sometimes criticized for failing to enforce strict enough punishment within the ranks. Public praise also celebrated rulers who moved swiftly across the provinces during campaigns or devoted their energy to defending the empire's frontiers. Military success thus became a central element in shaping the emperor's reputation. In an age marked by invasions and internal rebellions, the emperor's military role gained even greater importance. Victory in war not only protected the empire but also strengthened the ruler's claim to authority and reinforced the perception of divine favour. Courage in battle and success against enemies became powerful symbols of legitimacy. While courage was associated with war, the virtues required in times of peace were equally significant. Justice stood at the centre of the emperor's responsibilities in civil life. A ruler was expected to display fairness, compassion, and accessibility. listening to the petitions of his subjects and ensuring that laws were applied with humanity. He was responsible for abolishing unjust regulations and establishing laws that promoted order and fairness. From the earliest periods of Roman rule, the administration of justice had been a fundamental duty of the emperor, shaping his relationship with the population. The emperor's judicial role was often regarded as his most important function outside the battlefield. He was responsible not only for issuing legal decisions, but also for correcting flaws in existing laws and ensuring that justice was properly enforced. The ruler was frequently viewed as the embodiment of law itself, the ultimate source of legal authority and the living expression of the state's order. This idea reinforced the autocratic structure of imperial government, presenting the emperor as the central figure through whom the state functioned. Over time, this concept acquired a religious dimension. The emperor came to be seen as a representative of divine justice on earth, responsible for maintaining order according to a higher moral standard. Law itself held enormous significance within Roman society. It was regarded as one of the defining features of civilization, distinguishing Roman culture from what was perceived as the disorder of foreign peoples. Legal institutions represented rationality, discipline, and the supremacy of reason over violence, and these ideals contributed to the legitimacy of imperial authority. The emperor's judicial responsibilities also involved practical communication with his subjects. Citizens could submit written petitions requesting decisions or clarifications, and the emperor would issue official responses. Although such interactions were often limited to the more privileged members of society, they nevertheless demonstrated the broad scope of imperial concern. Legislation addressed a wide range of issues, from taxation and property rights to the regulation of urban life and economic activity. The routine nature of such decisions reinforced the perception of the emperor as the ultimate source of justice and authority. Roman law, however, primarily protected property and economic interests, meaning that much of the emperor's legal activity focused on the concerns of landowners and the social elite. His involvement in these matters increased the significance of his decisions, as they affected those who held substantial power within society. Although some administrative duties were gradually delegated to high officials, the emperor remained the central figure in legal matters, and his role as judge continued to be emphasized. Historical accounts reveal how rulers were evaluated according to their commitment to justice. Some were praised for fairness and careful judgment, while others were criticized for harshness, greed, or cruelty. Compassion, clemency, and wisdom in legal decisions enhanced an emperor's reputation, while excessive severity or the pursuit of personal wealth damaged it. Moral character, therefore, remained closely linked to effective governance. Administrative responsibilities extended beyond legal decisions to include the appointment of officials and the organization of government. A new ruler needed to build a reliable administration by granting positions, titles, and honors to loyal supporters. These appointments strengthened his authority by creating networks of dependence and loyalty. The emperor's associates and advisors, who often held influential positions, played a crucial role in shaping policy and maintaining stability. Prudent selection of officials was widely regarded as a mark of good leadership. Successful rulers were those who chose capable individuals, distinguished by military skill, intellectual ability, or knowledge of law. They were expected to appoint honest and energetic administrators who would serve the interests of the state. Conversely, emperors who allowed themselves to be influenced by corrupt advisors, or who surrounded themselves with unworthy companions, risked undermining their authority. Relations with the traditional aristocracy also remained important. Although the political influence of the Senate had declined, its goodwill still carried symbolic value. Emperors sought to maintain favourable relations with the elite, granting them positions at court and engaging with them in public settings. Eloquence and education helped reinforce this relationship, as shared cultural values create a sense of connection between the ruler and the aristocratic class. The emperor's administrative duties also included managing the provinces and supervising the vast imperial bureaucracy. Effective governance required the appointment of honest governors who would enforce laws fairly rather than exploit the population. The ruler was expected to balance the need for taxation with concern for the welfare of his subjects, ensuring that financial burdens remained bearable. Cooperation with local elites was essential, since they played a key role in collecting taxes and administering provincial affairs. Through the distribution of privileges and financial relief, the emperor could strengthen loyalty among influential groups. Opinions about individual rulers varied widely. Some were praised for reducing tax burdens and protecting provincial interests, while others were condemned for allowing exploitation and neglecting the welfare of their subjects. Careful management of administration and taxation, therefore, became another measure of imperial competence. Wisdom and self-control formed the final components of the ideal imperial character. A ruler was expected to demonstrate superior understanding and sound judgment, surpassing others in intelligence and insight. His personal conduct was to reflect moderation, discipline, and high moral standards. Restraint in food and drink, control of personal desires, and dignity in behaviour were all considered signs of true authority. Descriptions of emperors frequently comment on their personal habits. Some were praised for moderation and self-discipline, living simple lives and avoiding excess. Others were criticised for indulgence, lack of restraint, or moral weakness. Chastity and moral purity were particularly valued, and rulers who maintained strict standards within their courts were regarded as exemplary. Public praise also emphasized qualities such as patience, kindness, accessibility, and cheerfulness. An ideal emperor was not only powerful but also approachable and compassionate. He was expected to guide his subjects through personal example, correcting the faults of others, while living according to principles of simplicity and restraint. A late Roman emperor was expected to look the part, but appearance and upbringing were only the opening act. A handbook, like Menander's Guide to Imperial Praise, is useful precisely because it lays out what an audience was trained to notice, the virtues an emperor needed to display, and the practical roles those virtues implied. Behind the language of praise sat a constant political problem. Every reign had to answer the same question: why this man, and why now? The claim to rule had to be framed inside an accepted moral vocabulary. Courage, justice, wisdom, and self-control were not just personal qualities. They were the public standards by which imperial power was explained. Skilled speechwriters could turn these standards into a story of rightful authority, shaping how a ruler's position was understood by the people who mattered most. Yet legitimacy did not function like a legal certificate handed out at the start. In the Roman world, it was often judged after the fact. A government could declare itself chosen and proper, but the final assessment usually came later, measured by results and by how a reign ended. Success created its own retroactive logic. Failure could drain meaning from the most carefully staged beginnings. The first and most persuasive sign of legitimacy was victory. A ruler who won battles could claim that the heavens favoured him, and once that claim took hold, other supporting arguments could be arranged behind it. Praise could then connect the emperor's successes to the expected virtues, and present them as proof that the right person held the throne. The idea that divine backing mattered more than anything else ran through public presentations of emperors. It often appears as an assumption rather than a point to be argued, because it was supposed to feel obvious. If a ruler was truly appointed by a higher power, then virtue followed naturally. The logic was simple and ruthless. A defeated candidate could not plausibly be the chosen one. Victory was treated almost as a built-in imperial trait, something that revealed who the emperor really was. Narratives of successful rulers sometimes describe them as if fortune itself carried them forward, turning military achievement into a sign of destiny. Christian writers often press the connection even harder, presenting triumph as the reward for honoring the one true God. In that picture, military success was not merely strategy and discipline. It was a visible mark of blessing, and the emperor's invincibility flowed from his relationship with the divine. Law could also be used to anchor a ruler's claim to authority. Late Roman political culture tied the law-giving emperor to a sense of cosmic order. Issuing legislation, organizing legal collections, and presenting reforms as moral correction became ways to show that the emperor was not simply powerful, but rightful. Law carried enormous symbolic weight because it was treated as a defining feature of Roman civilization. It was part of the empire's self-image as a rational, orderly world standing apart from outsiders imagined as violent or uncultured. That made legal action a sensitive and effective stage for legitimacy. A ruler could present himself as protector of civilization, guardian of justice, and maker of clarity in a dangerous world. Even the language that introduced laws could be shaped to imply that rule was sanctioned from above and aimed at the common good. The manner of accession also mattered. A properly conducted elevation, carried out with recognized ceremony, could strengthen claims of divine approval and signal that the new ruler fit the official story the empire told about itself. In that story, the empire was not just a political structure, but a vehicle of providence, and the right emperor was guided into place. Orators could portray elections as decisions made with heavenly agreement, especially after periods of instability. The more uncertain the recent past, the more important it became to describe the new beginning as calm, unanimous, and endorsed by forces beyond human choice. Blood ties could help, even though the imperial office was not legally hereditary. Being related to a previous emperor offered a ready-made bridge to continuity, a way to borrow prestige from an earlier reign already accepted as legitimate. In theory, a ruler was elected, but the public role of the people in that process had long been mostly symbolic. In practice, the Senate still performed formal acts of confirmation, but the army's voice became increasingly decisive. That is why usurpers so often grounded their claims in military acclamation. Soldiers could raise a man up in the name of necessity, and once an army proclaimed its choice, a rival government had to respond. By the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, imperial rule was also being reorganized to meet crisis. Power was divided across regions, and multiple emperors operated at once. This arrangement reduced delays, allowed faster military responses, and increased the visible presence of government in different parts of the empire. Later reforms separated major military commands from civil administration, creating distinct chains of authority. The multiplication of emperors also served a symbolic purpose. It suggested continuity in the face of death and reinforced the idea that the empire could not be left without a guiding hand. Naming a junior colleague or appointing a subordinate emperor could strengthen legitimacy by presenting the newcomer as chosen by an already ruling and supposedly favoured senior. At the same time, it introduced new tensions. 2 courts had to cooperate, 2 rulers had to appear united, and the message of harmony had to be broadcast loudly, especially during emergencies. Public praise often leaned heavily on images of perfect partnership, because unity itself was treated as evidence of divine support. Accounts of accessions reveal how these ideas played out in practice. A candidate raised by the senior ruler could be presented as properly selected and carefully installed. A candidate acclaimed by troops could be described as confirmed by victory and therefore by heaven. Another familiar theme was reluctance. When a new emperor was shown hesitating, refusing honours, or appearing modest, the performance suggested virtue and suitability. The man who did not crave power seemed safer, more disciplined, more worthy. In contrast, hurried or chaotic accessions could be made to look suspicious. If an emperor was raised by a small, agitated group, rather than by a broad consensus, the story could imply that the event lacked divine backing, even if the outcome was accepted for a time. Ceremony mattered because it turned ideology into something visible. Imperial clothing, insignia, and formal ritual were treated as proof that power had been assumed correctly. When those symbols were missing, improvised, or ridiculous, the entire claim could be undermined. Stories of would-be rulers scrambling for purple garments, settling for makeshift substitutes, or appearing in attire fit for servants, rather than emperors, were more than gossip. They were narrative signals that the regime did not fit the proper pattern. Such episodes also reveal something else. Legitimacy was often judged by outcomes. Writers could portray losers as lacking the right signs from the beginning. Even short-lived rulers might be remembered as oddly ill-fitting, literally and figuratively, as if the office rejected them. Establishing a new reign could also involve discrediting what came before. Public speakers sometimes contrasted earlier bloodshed or disorder with the peace and stability of a new government, crafting an argument that the present deserved support because it was morally better. These comparisons mattered even more when members of the previous ruling family remained alive and could be treated as potential rivals. Dynastic marriages became useful tools in this landscape. They could link a new regime to older prestige, soften the problem of a newcomer's lack of ancestry, and reassure elites who preferred continuity. Such tactics were aimed above all at the influential landowners, officials, and commanders whose acceptance made rule workable. Taken together, late Roman legitimacy rested on a cluster of reinforcing ideas. Divine favour was the centre, most convincingly displayed through victory and prosperity. The emperor's role as the source of law offered another pillar, especially when law was presented as the mark of civilization itself. Proper accession ritual signalled correctness and order, while the denigration of rivals helped clear the field. A ruler's legitimacy in practice depended on how he came to power, whether his reign succeeded, and how later judgment interpreted the whole story. Because divine favour mattered so much, the emperor also carried a religious burden. Earlier, rhetorical guides did not set out a separate religious job description, partly because ancient political life did not imagine a clean division between sacred and secular authority. Traditionally, the emperor stood at the head of public religion, and that expectation did not disappear when emperors became Christian. The role changed shape, but it remained central. The Christian ruler was increasingly presented as God's appointed representative on earth. Matters connected with the emperor retained a sacred aura, even though old practices like the deification of dead emperors no longer fit Christian belief. Christian writers expanded the ideal portrait most clearly in this area. The emperor was expected to promote unity of belief, to protect the church, and to act as a guardian of religious peace. In practice, this could mean convening councils to resolve disputes, presiding with bishops, encouraging agreement, and sometimes using state power to enforce decisions. Some accounts depict emperors as supervisors of the church's welfare, intervening when doctrine, threatened unity. They also describe actions against pagan cult sites, portraying such measures as part of the emperor's duty to reshape society's religious life. Yet the role could be contradictory. Even Christian emperors could maintain older responsibilities tied to traditional institutions, filling vacancies in pagan priesthoods as part of inherited office. Pagan observers, meanwhile, could acknowledge the emperor's influence on religious controversies without endorsing his theology. They could criticize rulers who fueled disputes through argument and pressure rather than calming them. Other emperors were praised for tolerance, and intellectuals outside the church could applaud policies that avoided persecution and maintained civic peace. As the church's structure grew, the relationship between emperor and bishops became more complex. Later labels, like Caesaropapism, can mislead because ancient people did not share modern assumptions about separate spheres. Still, changes were underway. The emperor was not clergy and could not perform sacraments, but he held enormous leverage. He could call councils, shape policy, appoint bishops, exile opponents, fund church building, hear appeals, and attempt to impose doctrinal uniformity. In a world that feared divine punishment for religious disorder, unity was not merely a theological ideal. It was treated as a political necessity. The emperor's duty to prevent division could become a justification for coercion against those defined as wrong believers. Even conflicts between bishops and emperors can be read as political theatre as much as confrontation. A famous case from the end of the 4th century is often described as a bishop humiliating an emperor. Yet it can also be understood as a managed rehabilitation after a catastrophe. Public penance could become a display that restored the ruler's moral standing and transformed scandal into a story of repentance and renewal. In that reading, bishop and emperor appear less as enemies than as partners producing a public outcome that benefited both church discipline and imperial stability. Emperors expressed their religious role in many ways. Laws against pagan practice, major church building projects, council assemblies to settle doctrine, and public performances of piety all served as signals that the ruler stood in the right relationship with God. Military success was often tied to these religious claims, especially for rulers who were both active commanders and conspicuously devout. Victory and piety could be presented as inseparable, each proving the other. The emphasis on divine favour and rightful rule helped drive a visible growth in ceremony. Late Roman court ritual became more elaborate and more theatrical, and observers often explained this as an Eastern or Persian influence, associating it with a major reforming emperor of the earlier period. Whether that explanation was accurate mattered less than the perception itself. People believed the imperial style had changed, and that belief reflected a deeper shift. The emperor was no longer portrayed as a first citizen, pretending to be an ordinary magistrate. The system was openly autocratic. Ceremony became a language, communicating distance, hierarchy, and sacred authority. New rituals reinforced the idea that the emperor's position was unique and inviolable. Courtiers performed gestures of submission, and symbolic acts could mark forgiveness, favour, and restored status. In formal interactions with the Senate, ritual acclamations could eclipse genuine deliberation. There are accounts of assemblies consumed by scripted praise, repeated declarations of loyalty, and carefully staged unity. The length and performance of these acclamations mattered, even when the content could be delivered quickly. The spectacle was the message: harmony, perfection, and legitimacy presented as undeniable facts. One of the clearest moments when imperial power became visible to ordinary people was the emperor's ceremonial arrival in a city. These entrances were not casual visits. They were carefully staged, public performances, designed to show what the emperor was, why he ruled, and how far above daily life his authority stood. A famous example comes from the mid-4th century, when the reigning emperor entered Rome in a scene remembered for its controlled grandeur. The emperor's posture, silence, and rigid self-command projected an image that felt almost inhuman, remote, elevated, and untouchable. To many observers, this kind of display seemed to confirm that the late Roman ruler had become a distant figure, more like a sacred presence than a reachable leader. But that impression only tells part of the story. Once inside the city, the same emperor behaved in ways that do not fit the idea of a permanently unapproachable monarch. He addressed the political elite in formal settings, spoke to the wider crowd from a public platform, attended spectacles, and even seemed to enjoy the quick humour and bold remarks of ordinary people. The shift suggests something more practical than a simple transformation into a frozen idol. Imperial behaviour could change depending on the setting. The ruler was expected to know when to present himself as a military commander surrounded by awe, and when to perform as a civil leader who could speak, listen, and appear present among his subjects. What mattered was not a single style of rule, but the ability to switch roles without weakening authority. This expectation that an emperor must adjust his public conduct to the moment appears repeatedly in late Roman commentary. Private faults might exist, but the office demanded self-control and a sense of limits. An emperor who drank too heavily or pursued pleasure too openly could be criticized. Yet it was also assumed that time and responsibility might force such a man to correct himself once he fully understood the weight of imperial dignity. The point was not moral perfection in private life. The point was a disciplined public image that matched the demands of rank. Some rulers earned praise precisely because they seemed to understand this, keeping a careful sense of distance, posture, and restraint. Others drew criticism for acting in ways that looked too casual, too familiar, or too unaware of what the role required in specific circumstances. The problem was not simply personality, but the failure to perform decorum. Behaviour that fit the moment, the audience, and the symbolism of power. Even so, the greatest ceremonies could only reach a fraction of the empire. The Roman world was immense, and most people would never witness a grand arrival, never see the emperor in person, and might never even be close enough to identify him. For that majority, the emperor existed through images and messages. Portraits displayed in public spaces, official likenesses placed in prominent locations, and coinage circulating through markets and military camps. All had to carry the same basic meaning. This ruler is legitimate, protected by higher power, and endowed with extraordinary qualities. The imperial face needed to persuade even those who lived far from the court that the empire had a centre and that the man at that centre mattered. Material generosity also worked as a kind of message. Funding public works, supporting institutions, and sponsoring major building projects signalled that the emperor's authority was not only distant, but also beneficial. Under Christian emperors, this could be expressed through especially visible support for churches across the provinces, including new construction and the upgrading of older buildings. Such gifts were not simply pious acts, they were political communication in stone, wood, and gold, evidence that the ruler cared about the moral order of the empire, about community identity, and about the well-being of groups that mattered socially and spiritually. Through benefaction, an emperor could appear present even when physically absent. This is where the rhetorical blueprint offered by Menander becomes useful again. It provides a neat way of naming the virtues and roles that late Roman society expected from a ruler. The categories are not the only way to describe the imperial job, but they help break down a complicated office into recognizable pieces. An emperor was supposed to embody courage, justice, wisdom, and self-control. He was expected to be competent in war, though competence could mean direct command, strategic planning, or ensuring that the army was supplied and loyal. He was expected to govern in peace through fair justice, stable administration, and careful appointments. In both war and peace, he had to manage politics, because the empire depended on the cooperation of powerful groups, commanders, officials, and land-owning elites. Keeping these people loyal required rewards, recognition, and constant attention to the balance of influence. Some elements of the imperial role had deep roots and hardly changed in outline, even as their presentation shifted. Others were genuinely new. The most striking new element in the 4th century was the expanding Christian dimension of imperial identity. The emperor was increasingly expected to protect correct belief, encourage unity within the church, and act as the leading defender of the faith, all while still fulfilling older expectations of justice and order. Traditional virtues could remain in place, but they could be recolored with Christian emphasis. Justice, for example, could be praised not only as fairness toward the powerful, but also as compassion toward the poor and vulnerable. Because the moral language of imperial virtue was long established, writers with different religious commitments could still describe emperors using the same framework. The vocabulary stayed familiar even when its meaning gained new tones. In the end, legitimacy depended on more than ritual and words. If a reign prospered, if it survived crises, defeated enemies, and maintained stability, then later judgment would tend to label it divinely favoured, and therefore rightful. During the ruler's lifetime, magnificent ceremony helped sustain this belief by making legitimacy visible. Success reinforced the story, and the story in turn strengthened authority. By the late 360s, this shared model of what an emperor should be provides a starting point for understanding a difficult political experiment: the rise of child rulers in the Western Empire. No adult emperor could perfectly meet every expectation on the unwritten checklist, and different situations pushed different virtues to the foreground. Some moments demanded military strength above all else. Others demanded legal skill, administrative control, or religious leadership. The office was heavy even for a capable adult. The question becomes sharper when the ruler is a boy. If grown men struggled to embody the full range of required roles, what happened when the imperial figure was too young to lead armies, dominate councils, or personally manage a court? This problem can be followed through 3 broad stages in the Western Empire. First comes the moment of accession. Who proclaimed the boy, under what pressure, and with what political calculations? Particular importance attaches to the precedent, created when a ruling emperor raised a young heir to share power, because that act provided a model that later groups around the throne could reuse when their interest required it. The second stage is the long middle of a reign, where success or failure often turns on military realities. A child cannot command in the field, and that absence forces others to govern in his name. Different solutions appear: collective rule by committees and factions, or control by a single dominant manager. The third stage is the battle over image. Traditional expectations of emperors did not disappear simply because the ruler was young, so official presentation had to adapt. Public language, ceremony, and propaganda had to find ways to explain how the empire was still being led properly. At the same time, traces of strain tend to leak through, revealing when practical demands were not being met despite all efforts to maintain the ideal picture. This son of mine, Gratian, has grown up among your own children. You know him, and you care for him. He stands between the army and my house as a living bond. So, To keep peace steady on every frontier, the plan is to raise him as partner in imperial power. If the favour of heaven and the approval of your rank support what a father's loyalty urges. That is how the scene is remembered. An emperor speaking like a commander and a parent at once, asking soldiers to accept a boy as part of the ruling structure. In the year 367, the decision to elevate young Gratian did more than strengthen one family's position. It created a precedent that later leaders would copy with increasing boldness. The careers of the half-brothers, Gratian and Valentinian the Younger, who would sometimes be presented as joint rulers, became the first major test case for child emperors in the Western Empire. The standards of what a proper emperor should be had been repeated for generations. Courage, justice, wisdom, self-control, these were the familiar labels. The difficulty is that an 8-year-old could not plausibly display most of what those virtues were supposed to mean in practice. Modern accounts have often treated these accessions as routine dynastic moments, but at the time they pushed the imperial office into new territory. A child could be crowned, placed on coins, praised in speeches. But how could that child be made to look like a ruler who truly met the old expectations? Before that question can be answered, the political crises that produce these child elevations have to be placed in view. The rise of Gratian at 8, and later of Valentinian the Younger at 4, did not happen because the empire suddenly embraced childhood as an ideal. These moments were driven by fear, rivalry, and calculation. The key question is not simply how they happened, but why powerful people chose this solution when other options existed. The two brothers, in a sense, each experienced two beginnings. One was an early elevation that created a title and a public image, while real authority remained elsewhere. The other was the moment when they actually stood at the top because the senior ruler was dead and the empire needed decisions in their name. Gratian was crowned while his father still lived, then became the effective Western ruler only after his father's sudden death. Years later, Valentinian the Younger was raised while Gratian still lived, then became the main Western emperor only after Gratian himself was removed. These first accessions shaped expectations and propaganda, while the second accessions determined how the empire actually functioned. Gratian's first elevation was staged with dramatic care. In late August of 367, in a military setting, his father appeared before the troops with senior figures around him, took the child by the hand, and presented him as the army's future. The emperor spoke at length, partly to the soldiers, partly to the boy, framing the promotion as a measure for stability and as a hope invested in a young heir. The soldiers answered with visible enthusiasm. The child was crowned, dressed in imperial clothing, and publicly transformed from a prince into an emperor in name. This was not the first sign that Gratian was being prepared for prominence. He had already been honoured with a consulship and granted an elevated courtly title that marked him out as special. But turning an 8-year-old into an Augustus was still extraordinary. Even raising a grown man straight to full imperial status rather than the lower rank that usually came first could be presented as unusual. To do this for a child was even more startling. The difference mattered because the title Augustus implied complete participation in imperial authority. In theory, it made the boy a full partner in ruling the Roman world. Everyone understood the reality that a child would remain passive while his father lived. But the public claim was still radical. It redefined what could be said about power. So why do it? The answer appears to lie in the atmosphere of insecurity. Only a few years earlier, the empire had watched emperors die unexpectedly, leaving armies and courts scrambling. After one sudden death, soldiers demanded an insurance policy, a second ruler who could stabilize the situation if disaster struck again. That pressure helped explain why the Western Emperor had earlier brought his brother into the imperial college. By 367, the fear returned in another form. Reports circulated that the Western Emperor had been seriously ill. Court circles began whispering about succession. Rival groups reportedly weighed possible replacements. The boy, despite his honours, was not treated as the automatic choice. That detail matters. It suggests that dynasty was not yet a strong enough principle to silence ambitious men the moment a ruler's health faltered. Once the emperor recovered, his advisors urged him to settle the question publicly, before speculation hardened into a dangerous struggle. The response was decisive. Instead of choosing an adult partner in the West, who might later become a rival, he chose a child, his own son. It was a political move as much as a father's decision. A child could be elevated without becoming an independent power center. An adult co-ruler might demand real authority, build a faction, and eventually compete for the throne. A boy could wear the purple while others governed around him. In that sense, the promotion of Gratian was both a dynastic declaration and a way of denying the court the chance to impose another candidate. The speech remembered from that day tries to sell the choice using the only arguments available. The boy is said to have grown up among the soldiers' families, to be loved as a link between army and ruler, and to be shaped by education and family tradition. These are not battlefield credentials, they are promises. The future is offered in place of present achievement. That is exactly why the event marks a turning point. Public praise now had to treat potential as if it were performance. The imperial ideal remained the same, but the emperor being praised could not possibly have lived it yet. From this moment, Gratian became the symbol of a new dynasty's future. The court began to present his elevation as the dawn of a fresh era. Speeches praised the new boy emperor as if the empire already rested in his hands, even though his father and an adult uncle still ruled. At this stage, the arrangement was safe because there was no need for the child to act. He could remain a silent figure while adults governed, allowing the regime to enjoy the benefits of dynastic propaganda without suffering the immediate costs of child rule. Even so, the long-term risk had been introduced. If the boy survived and eventually became the sole ruler, the empire might one day find itself forced to treat a minor as the embodiment of virtues that demanded adult action. The regime's messaging leaned heavily on hope and continuity. Coin slogans celebrated a new age and tied the boy to the future of the state. The language deliberately echoed earlier imperial dynasties that had successfully promoted heirs. By borrowing familiar formulas, the new ruling house could imply that it belonged in the same tradition of legitimate, blessed government. But the shift was still visible. An emperor was being praised, not for victories, reforms, or judgment, but for what he might become. The empire was being asked to believe in the promise of a child wearing the highest title. In later centuries, the practice of granting full imperial rank to children became common, especially in the Eastern Empire, and that later normality can make the first steps seem less dramatic than they were. In the 360s, however, an 8-year-old Augustus was not a routine pattern. It was a bold response to insecurity. Other rulers had highlighted infants in ceremonial ways, granting consulships, placing children beside them in public honours, speaking about future glory. But that was not the same as proclaiming a child a full emperor. In earlier cases, a child might have been expected to rise slowly through ranks if circumstances allowed. Here, the highest title was granted immediately, and that speed changed the meaning of succession. The precedent also sparked wider imagination. In the East, there were hints that a similar move might occur, with hopes expressed about a balanced arrangement of rulers in both halves of the empire, fathers paired with sons. but life intervened. The Eastern child died young, and the plan never became reality. Even so, the idea had been spoken aloud. The empire could be pictured as governed by paired dynasties, almost like matched teams. That kind of vision only becomes possible once a child, Augustus, has already existed. Then came 375, and the experiment intensified. The Western emperor died suddenly during a campaign. The death itself became part of the story. A man in full authority collapsing without warning, leaving a military environment charged with uncertainty. Gratian, now 16, was far away in Trier. The Eastern emperor was further still. The immediate scene was controlled by senior officers and court figures who had been with the dead emperor. They held the secret at first, moved quickly and began shaping the succession before the official heir could even arrive. This was Gratian's real moment of succession, the point where his earlier elevation mattered. His father had made him difficult to ignore, but acceptance was not automatic. The distance between Trier and the campaign area created a dangerous gap. In that gap, it was possible for ambitious commanders to imagine alternatives. Certain generals were treated as potential threats precisely because they were popular enough to be acclaimed by soldiers. One was quietly sent away to prevent his name from becoming a rallying point. The fact that such precautions were taken shows that the situation was not calm, and that an adult military leader could still look more natural to soldiers than a teenage emperor who was not present. A leading commander was rushed back to the camp, and the succession was discussed in a circle that did not include the existing emperors. The solution chosen was striking. Proclaim the 4-year-old half-brother of Gratian as Augustus as well. This was presented as a protective measure, an attempt to secure loyalty and prevent the troops in Gaul from drifting toward a usurper. The boy was fetched from where he lived with his mother, brought to the camp in a litter, and proclaimed emperor within days of his father's death. It was a fast, decisive act, carried out without asking the consent of either the teenage Western Augustus or the Eastern emperor. On the surface, the logic sounds defensive. Create a dynastic symbol on the spot, wrap the succession in family legitimacy, and deny the soldiers the chance to elevate a general. It is a plausible explanation, especially in a military crisis. A child prince could serve as a banner of continuity that discouraged civil war, but the choice remains unusual. The empire was not truly leaderless. 2 emperors already existed. Gratian was 16 and had spent years as a titled co-ruler, learning under his father's shadow. In a purely administrative sense, a third Augustus was not required. The decision becomes easier to understand when attention shifts from what the empire needed to what powerful men near the camp wanted. The pattern of removals around this moment is revealing. Competent generals who might compete for influence were pushed aside or vanished from the scene. One was sent away immediately. Another famous commander, successful and well-connected, was arrested and executed far from the main theatre, under circumstances that strongly suggest high politics rather than routine discipline. If these moves were connected, they point to a clear aim: eliminate strong military rivals and replace them with an arrangement that allowed influence to be exercised behind a child's throne. A 4-year-old emperor cannot lead armies or control appointments. That means real power flows to whoever manages access, documents, and decisions. In such a setup, the imperial title becomes a shield: legitimacy in public, controllability in practice. The key figures named in the surviving narratives fit this interpretation. Senior military commanders were involved, as were men tied to the imperial family through marriage rather than blood. A prominent aristocrat with deep standing among the wealthy elite appears in the background as well. the event looks less like an inevitable dynastic reflex and more like a coordinated action, almost a coup carried out under the cover of public safety. The child's dynastic connection offered legitimacy, while the real beneficiaries could be the men who arranged the proclamation and then positioned themselves as indispensable. It is tempting to treat the rise of Valentinian the Younger as the triumph of dynasty, as if a family claim naturally pushed aside all other possibilities. The reality looks more complicated. The boy's elevation was not a simple outcome of inheritance. It was a choice made rapidly by a specific group at a specific moment. It was shaped by fear of usurpation, but also by opportunism. The dynasty provided a convenient mask for politics that could otherwise look illegitimate. Power seized without authorization, rivals neutralized, and new leverage created over the teenage emperor who technically already held the Western throne. Some have argued that the child was acceptable precisely because he was harmless, too young to interfere, too young to govern, useful as a symbol. That raises the real question: harmless to whom, and useful for whose agenda? Gratian was his father's clear heir. The younger child was, in practical terms, an extra piece placed on the board. There is no firm sign that the dead emperor had already decided to split the Western Empire between his sons. If the younger boy had a planned future, it had not been publicly developed in the way Gratian's had. That makes the sudden leap to full imperial status even more dramatic. Seen this way, the proclamation of Valentinian the Younger becomes more than an emergency measure. It becomes a tool. By raising the child, certain power holders created a second Western Augustus, who could be used as pressure against Gratian, shaping appointments and policies through the threat of divided loyalty. It was a move against the old inner circle that had served the dead emperor, because controlling the new child emperor's household and court could allow a new faction to dominate the regime. The crisis was real, but the response also created new opportunities for those who acted first. This is what makes the emergence of child emperors in the Western Empire so historically significant. The imperial office was still bound to expectations of military command, justice, administration, and dignified public conduct. Yet in these moments, the empire accepted emperors who could not perform the most basic practical duties of an imperator. That acceptance did not come from a sudden change in ideals. It came from political calculation. A child could be a legitimate emblem without becoming an independent actor. The result was a new kind of imperial politics, where legitimacy could be borrowed from a dynasty, while power moved into the hands of managers, generals, and aristocrats operating behind the throne. If the events of November 375 are viewed through this lens, the early character of the two Western governments becomes easier to distinguish. Gratian had been lifted into imperial rank while still a child, largely to lock the throne inside his father's household, and to announce that the ruling family intended to become a true dynasty. Yet when his father died, even after years of preparation under close supervision, Gratian did not step into a settled inheritance. He stepped into a court fractured by competing interests. Different circles around him tried to shape policy, appointments, and public tone, and the very fact that his household could be divided into rival camps made the regime vulnerable. Instead of a young ruler simply continuing his father's style, the new government became a contested space in which powerful people maneuvered for advantage. For Valentinian the Younger, the situation was harsher from the beginning. His elevation had not grown out of his own standing or any public expectation that he would lead. It had been engineered in the heat of crisis, and it depended, from its first hour, on whether others found it useful. His title offered legitimacy without independence. That combination could be extremely attractive to the ruling class. For influential ministers and aristocrats, a child emperor could be a safer instrument than an adult colleague or rival. A boy could confer lawful authority through his name and family connection while remaining manageable behind palace doors. This arrangement, however, carried a price. It required removing threats. If the regime was to be shaped from behind the throne, adult alternatives with genuine military followings had to be neutralized, especially successful commanders, who might be acclaimed by soldiers. The early careers of Gratian and Valentinian the Younger therefore signal a shift in how parts of the military and senatorial elite were beginning to think about the imperial office. The throne was becoming something that could be controlled more effectively by placing a young, legitimate figure on it, rather than by elevating one of their own and risking a strong emperor who could resist pressure. The deeper question is what this calculation would do to the office itself over time. The first arena in which these pressures become visible is regime building, especially the relationship between the new government and the old Roman aristocracy. In the final years of the elder Valentinian's reign, a climate of fear had spread among sections of the nobility. A string of prosecutions for alleged wrongdoing, including cases involving magic accusations and private misconduct, struck the senatorial world particularly hard. The most infamous punishments were linked in public memory to a powerful official in Rome whose methods were associated with brutality and arrogance. The overall scale of these proceedings can be debated, but the political effect is clearer. Relations between the Western court and the senatorial elite had been damaged, and many in Rome had grown wary of what the regime might do next. When the elder emperor died, and his two sons stood at the center of the Western state, the future felt uncertain. The exact text of Gratian's first message to the Senate has not survived, yet reactions from leading aristocrats reveal its impact. The tone was received as a break with the past. The period was described as the opening of a brighter era, a moment in which the old elite expected relief rather than threat. The most visible symbol of this new mood came quickly. The official most closely linked to the earlier terror did not long outlive his patron and was executed under the new rule, reportedly for intolerable arrogance. By the end of the following summer, the group of men widely blamed for the harsh policies of the late reign had been cleared from office. That purge was more than vengeance. It was a public signal aimed at Rome's highest families. The new emperor was willing to reset the relationship. The gestures did not stop there. Senators who had suffered under earlier prosecutions were recalled, rehabilitated, and honoured. Measures favourable to aristocratic interests followed in law and practice. Administrative changes were introduced that strengthened the authority of Rome's top civic office over key responsibilities and reduced the possibility of hostile outsiders using certain posts as stepping stones to dominance. Even the pattern of appointments conveyed a message. Under Gratian, holders of the city's highest prefecture tended to serve shorter terms than before, and the post went overwhelmingly to men from the Roman aristocracy itself. Rapid turnover meant more families could be brought into the circle of prestige. It spread goodwill widely and quickly, and it made the reconciliation feel tangible rather than symbolic. Part of this conciliatory policy can be linked to the political reality created by the proclamation of Valentinian the Younger. The men who had helped arrange that sudden elevation, including prominent aristocrats, gained leverage. They were positioned to press Gratian toward accommodation with the Senate in exchange for support and stability. Yet, it would be too simple to treat Gratian's policy as nothing but submission to pressure. The new emperor needed allies. His father had possessed a reputation for military authority and had built a network of trusted associates who helped anchor his power. Gratian, by contrast, stood on dynastic claim and youthful status. He had not yet proved himself through victories or decisive administration in his own right. The crisis of 375 had shown, in the starkest way, how fragile his position could be when he was absent and generals were nearby. In such a climate, courting the wealth and influence of Rome's senatorial elite was not optional. It was basic regime building, made more urgent by uncertainty over the loyalty of armies and the ambitions of commanders. At the same time, the role of Valentinian the Younger during the years before Gratian's fall shows how hollow child sovereignty could become once its immediate usefulness passed. Between the proclamation of the 4-year-old in 375 and the assassination of Gratian in 383, the younger emperor barely appears at decisive moments. Aside from ceremonial consulships, he fades from the record. The silence is itself evidence. It indicates that the child's position had no clear practical function in policy, war, or administration. His rule existed mainly as a name that could be invoked when convenient and ignored when not. Later writers speak of a division of the Western territories between the two brothers, assigning some regions to Gratian and others to Valentinian the Younger. In practice, such a clean partition is difficult to accept. For the first years after 375, a 4-year-old could not govern Italy, Africa, or the strategic middle lands of the empire, and the older brother's court effectively carried the responsibilities of the West. Contemporary observers treated Gratian as the real emperor in charge of Italy as well as the northern provinces. Official speeches addressed to Gratian spoke as if he ruled alongside his eastern colleague, with little or no attention paid to the younger child. Military requests and responses moved through Gratian's administration, not through the child's household. Even major territorial decisions, such as the later transfer of certain regions to a new eastern ruler, were handled through Gratian's authority. The youngest emperor had rank without an operating government. The evidence of public imagery points in the same direction. Mints tied to Gratian's court did not consistently present the two boys as equal partners. In many places, the younger emperor's coin legends marked him explicitly as junior, a label that turned sovereignty into dependency in the most visible medium of state communication. Only later did imagery begin to present the Western emperors together more strongly, and that timing suggests political needs rather than genuine equality. The overall impression is that Gratian's administration did not want Valentinian the Younger to look like an equal ruler. The child was carried along, not allowed to stand. This eclipse also suggests something about the men who had originally pushed for Valentinian the Younger's proclamation. Their immediate demands appear to have been satisfied. Their support swung behind Gratian once the crisis of 375 cooled. The most striking proof of that shift is the career of the general, who had been crucial in the earlier coup. Within a year he was serving as Gratian's senior military leader, strengthening frontier defences and receiving the highest honours of the state. That transformation reveals the paradox of a 4-year-old emperor. He could be used as a bargaining piece, yet once the bargaining was complete, he could be set aside. Child emperor politics at this stage was not a stable system. It was an improvisation that could turn a boy into a tool and then abandon him without ceremony. A major figure in Gratian's early government helps explain the domestic tone of the regime and the way the court sought allies in the aristocracy. A respected Gallic teacher of rhetoric had been brought to court years earlier to educate the young prince, likely around the time of Gratian's first elevation. By the time the elder Valentinian died, this tutor had become one of Gratian's most established advisors, already holding prestigious office and possessing deep personal access to the new emperor. The change in 375 gave him extraordinary opportunity. Honours and posts were distributed not only to him, but to his relatives and associates, producing a brief period in which his household formed the dominant political faction of the Western court. The pattern was unmistakable. A tutor became a kingmaker, and a family network spread across the top ranks of the administration. This concentration of influence has often been treated as the engine behind Gratian's turn toward reconciliation with the Senate. The evidence supports the idea that the tutor's circle valued cooperation with aristocratic interests and saw advantage in removing unpopular figures associated with the late terror. Letters exchanged between leading aristocrats reinforce the impression of a court eager to build bridges. But the limits of this influence matter too. The tutor could guide and benefit from the early shift, yet later events show he did not permanently control the emperor's choices. The court's factions remained unstable, and the young ruler's policy did not remain fixed in the pattern of his first years. Debate has long surrounded the meaning of these new appointments. Some have argued that replacing seasoned officials with aristocratic favourites was harmful, an early sign that wealth and status were beginning to crowd out professional administration. Others describe the government as being colonized by elite interests, leaving the emperor exposed. A calmer reading is possible. Much of the daily machinery of the late Roman state was carried by trained administrators below the highest ranks. Changes at the top did not necessarily destroy efficiency, yet perception mattered as much as function. A regime dominated by an educational court circle and aristocratic connections could look detached from military realities, and the empire still depended on soldiers and commanders for survival. A government that appeared overly tilted toward the Senate risked weakening its standing with the army. In a system where legitimacy was constantly tested by military loyalty, that was a dangerous imbalance. For most of the years before 383, Valentinian the Younger remained a shadow behind Gratian. Then, Gratian was killed by a usurper, and the younger boy's situation changed overnight. After 8 years as a decorated name with little substance, he became the only lawful Western emperor, at least in principle, and he was still only 12. The usurper had the advantage of force and momentum, yet the child emperor carried something the usurper lacked: the appearance of legitimate continuity. That made him an ideological threat, even if his military resources were thin. In response, a loyalist court formed quickly around him. The same interests that had once used him as leverage returned to defend him, because now he mattered again. Powerful senators had every reason to keep a court in Italy alive. If the usurper replaced it entirely, their influence over imperial politics would shrink. As a result, leading aristocrats returned to high office, including the reappearance of a prominent figure who had helped shape events years earlier. The loyalist group did not stop with one man. Other famous aristocrats were drawn into public leadership, including a celebrated pagan senator who had been absent from high office for years, and later, the appointment of the same aristocratic spokesman who had once praised Gratian as a hopeful dawn. These posts were not given purely out of admiration. They were instruments of survival. A child emperor needed a broad coalition to stand against a rival with armies. The old elite provided legitimacy, money, networks, and an image of continuity rooted in Rome itself. Military support, though weakened, was not absent. Gratian's famous general defected to the usurper, but another Frankish officer emerged as the main military pillar of the child's court. He had experience in major campaigns and may have had access to frontier manpower and allied groups who could be recruited for the loyalist cause. His rise marked another familiar pattern in child emperor politics: the shift from committee-style management to dominance by a single strong military figure. Observers at the rival court even accused him of seeking power for himself through a boy who could serve as a figurehead. The accusation reveals how child rule looked to contemporaries. An emperor could become a mask behind which a commander ruled. Religious and cultural politics also resurfaced once Valentinian the Younger became central. Under Gratian, harsh measures had been taken that affected old pagan privileges, and these decisions suggest that the earlier senatorial-friendly clique did not remain in full control of policy. After Gratian's death, the balance shifted again. The new regime needed support urgently, and the early months appeared favourable for pagan aristocrats to press their claims. High pagan office holders stood in prominent positions. The atmosphere seemed receptive, and there was reason to believe the court might reverse earlier restrictions. The famous controversy over a symbolic, civic monument in Rome became one of the most visible expressions of this struggle. Yet the pagan party faced a new obstacle: a powerful bishop who understood that religion could be used as a weapon in legitimacy politics. In a world where the emperor was expected to protect correct belief and stand as the guardian of religious order, doctrinal weakness could be turned into political danger. The bishop's letters and interventions made this clear. He invoked the orthodoxy of past rulers and pointedly referenced the faith of the usurper as well, raising a question that cut to the heart of imperial legitimacy. If the rightful emperor failed in religious duty, while a rival appeared to uphold true doctrine, could heaven's favour be claimed with confidence? This was not abstract theology. It was a threat to the ideological foundation of the child's reign. At the same time, the bishop's actions also show a complicated loyalty. He criticised and pressured the court, yet he repeatedly acted as envoy on behalf of the legitimate emperor, signalling that despite disputes, he preferred lawful continuity over successful rebellion. Two moments of emergency, first in 367 and then again in 375, had pushed very young boys onto the Western throne. The decisions were driven by adults who wanted continuity, calm, and control at the top of the state. Getting the boys acclaimed had been difficult enough, but that was only the opening act. After the death of the senior Western ruler, the real work began. Keeping a government functioning day after day, while the nominal head of that government was either still learning to rule, or, in the younger case, not even old enough to understand what rule meant. In the years that followed, the Western courts were forced to navigate tense relations with adult partners in the East, severe military shocks and constant pressure from rival circles inside the palace. Child emperor rule was no longer an idea. It became a daily experiment, tested by crisis after crisis. At the centre of the imperial college stood the Eastern ruler, an adult who had been raised to the throne soon after his brother took power in the West. From the start, public messaging cast the relationship between the two brothers as unequal. The Western emperor was presented as the dominant figure, while his Eastern counterpart appeared as a lawful partner, who nonetheless stood below him. The hierarchy was not subtle. Official language, public inscriptions, and even the way army units were described encouraged audiences to think in terms of senior and junior rulers. In some public statements, the Eastern ruler was framed less as an independent sovereign and more as a relative attached to the greater authority of the West, praised in a way that made the imbalance impossible to miss. That subordinate role may have been tolerated as long as the senior brother lived. The situation changed when the West added a child as a full imperial colleague. The Eastern court did not necessarily welcome the idea that an 8-year-old should be treated as an equal partner in the imperial office. A quiet form of resistance appeared in the way the Eastern side spoke about the boy, using family labels that made him sound like a junior relative rather than a fully formed ruler. Even in coin production, recognition in the East seems to have been restrained. Not blocked entirely, but handled in a way that avoided giving the child too much weight. The message was clear enough. The Eastern ruler could accept a younger brother beneath him, but a child nephew as an equal was another matter. After the Western senior emperor died, the tension sharpened. The proclamation of an even younger child as emperor was carried out without the adult rulers being consulted, and the new boy's authority was, in practice, more symbolic than real. Any supposed division of Western lands between the two brothers would have affected the older Western teenager more than it affected the East, yet it still created a dangerous impression that the West could rearrange itself without reference to the adult ruler, who now saw himself as the senior figure of the whole imperial partnership. In response, the Eastern court began to stress seniority in a more pointed way. New titles appeared that echoed earlier imperial habits of distinguishing a father from his sons. On medals and ceremonial issues, the adult ruler was shown physically dominating the two boys, marked out by scale and sacred visual signs that implied a higher rank. Some designs placed him between the children like a guardian, or like a master of the household, while others minimized one boy, or removed him from the scene altogether. The theme was consistent. The Eastern emperor did not intend to be treated as merely one more colleague among equals. This posture can be read as irritation, but it can also be understood as strategic protection. A public hierarchy could serve as a warning to anyone tempted to challenge the Western boys. Attack them, and the East will respond. In practice, the adult ruler did share high ceremonial honours with the younger Western child in the years that followed, which suggests a reluctant acceptance of the new arrangement, at least on paper. Yet the relationship remained uneasy, and the lead-up to a major Eastern catastrophe exposes how limited cooperation could become when pride, court politics, and military urgency collided. The Eastern ruler faced a serious frontier problem that grew from a breakdown in earlier arrangements and a mass movement of Gothic groups into imperial territory. What had been managed through treaties and controlled settlement turned into panic and disorder, then open war. As the danger expanded, requests went westward for reinforcements. Orders were issued for Western troops to support the Eastern campaign, with Western generals instructed to lead the assistance. The results were disappointing. Earlier support had been criticized as too small and too poor in quality, and the more serious failure involved desertion and delay. Soldiers melted away, and senior Western commanders appear to have discouraged the transfer of forces, fearing that stripping the West would invite raids along their own frontiers. Another Western leader avoided the war altogether by claiming illness. On the surface, aid was promised. On the ground, it arrived slowly, in pieces, and not always in the form the Eastern emperor needed. A major engagement in the summer of 377 brought heavy losses without a decisive outcome. The Eastern side needed more men. Another request for reinforcements went back to the West. Reports from later writers suggest that the Western leadership did not view the Eastern crisis as a direct threat to their own provinces, and that reluctance shaped their response. Still, by 378, the young Western emperor finally moved in person. At 19, he was no longer the child raised to power as insurance for a dynasty. He was a young adult heading an army, called to assist an older colleague in a struggle that was becoming existential. Then, the Western march toward the east slowed to a crawl for a reason that would later look almost absurd. Along the route, an Alemannic group tried to exploit the movement of troops by crossing the Rhine and raiding in the west. The Western emperor responded aggressively. Units already sent ahead were recalled. A force under his generals struck the raiders and drove them back. That should have ended the diversion, It did not. The emperor decided that driving them off was not enough and pursued the raiders into mountainous terrain, turning the episode into a sustained campaign of destruction. The fighting was intense and close, and the young emperor sought visibility in the action, reportedly pressing into the front ranks and insisting on a complete victory. Survivors were chased, trapped, forced into surrender, and then absorbed as recruits. From the perspective of the Eastern ruler, this delay was maddening. A huge crisis demanded unity and speed, and the Western army spent weeks, then months, burning time on a smaller frontier threat. From the perspective of the Western emperor, the choice is easier to explain. A 19-year-old ruler had grown up under the shadow of older men who defined legitimacy through military success. He was being asked for help by a senior emperor who was treated as the elder of the imperial partnership. Here was an opportunity for the young Western ruler to prove himself not through speeches or inherited rank, but through battlefield authority. The campaign offered personal glory and the chance to bind soldiers to him through shared danger. It also offered something else, a way to build a reputation independent of the powerful Western generals who had dominated military affairs since 375. Even if the decision harmed the empire's wider interests, it served the young emperor's political needs. A ruler who wanted genuine authority could not live forever as a name carried by others. He needed victories that belonged to him. The victory was celebrated. The Western emperor moved east again, but the damage had been done. Progress remained slow, and illness struck on the road, further delaying the march. Messages were sent ahead describing the Western success, presenting it as a triumph accomplished with energy and speed. The content mattered less than the effect. The Eastern court heard that the young emperor had won a victory, while the East bled. In this atmosphere, rivalry became dangerous. Ancient narratives portray the Eastern emperor as increasingly anxious about being upstaged. The Western victory, though small compared to the Gothic emergency, was inflated by supporters at court, with casualty numbers exaggerated wildly. The young emperor urged the Eastern ruler to wait and not risk a battle before the Western army arrived. Yet the Eastern ruler faced pressure from advisors and courtiers who encouraged bold action. He was also reportedly misled about the size of the Gothic forces. Pride, bad intelligence, and fear of losing the glory to a younger colleague combined into a single push toward a decision that could not be undone. On August 9, 378, the Eastern army met the Goths near Adrianople. The battle became one of the most devastating defeats of late Roman history. The Eastern emperor was killed and his body was never recovered. The catastrophe was not only military. It shattered the imperial partnership and exposed the fragility of the system that had placed the West in the hands of a young ruler and a child. At the moment of disaster, the Western emperor was still far away. He had reached Castra Martis, roughly 400 kilometers from the battlefield, still days and weeks from the point where his reinforcements could have mattered. The Eastern ruler had waited a long time, perhaps too long, and may have believed there was no time left to delay further. The Western army continued moving, then abruptly withdrew once the news arrived. Sirmium became a center of anxious decision-making. For months, uncertainty ruled. During this interval, the young Western emperor issued legislation for both halves of the empire, a sign that formal authority had not collapsed, even though the Eastern throne was empty. In January 379, a new emperor was raised in the East. The choice fell on a general with a strong reputation and a family name associated with military success. He had achieved victories earlier in his career, then withdrawn from public life after his father's sudden fall and execution. After Adrianople, messengers summoned him rapidly. The selection had logic. He was not tainted by the defeat. He carried an aura of competence, and he could plausibly restore confidence to an army shaken by disaster. Even so, the manner of his elevation remains open to interpretation. Some accounts present it as an appointment by the Western court, a rational step taken by the young Western emperor to share the burden and confront the crisis with experienced leadership. Other readings suspect a proclamation driven by troops and officers in the East, a move that the Western government chose to accept rather than challenge. A civil war would have been catastrophic at a moment when the empire was struggling simply to survive. Under those conditions, recognizing a strong general in the East could look less like weakness and more like triage. It may also explain why the Western court's planning for 379 still placed its own men in prominent ceremonial roles, hinting that the idea of creating a new Augustus might not have been the Western government's original plan when the general was first summoned to command the war. Whatever the mechanics behind the elevation, the early years that followed show practical cooperation between the Eastern and Western administrations. Key Illyrian dioceses were transferred to the new Eastern emperor, likely to ease recruitment, taxation, and supply for the war effort. Several important officials from the West moved into the new Eastern administration, suggesting an effort to stabilize the partnership through shared personnel and bureaucratic experience. Military support also flowed east. Western armies under senior commanders campaigned in the Balkans alongside the new Eastern ruler, and other Western officers were active in the same strategic region. The Western emperor did not personally command the Eastern campaigns, at least not clearly in the surviving record, but his government contributed men and resources when the Eastern War required them. Yet the larger lesson of Adrianople was impossible to ignore. The disaster had tested the new reality of child emperor politics and exposed its limits. After the Eastern emperor died, the empire still had two Augusti on paper, the 19-year-old in the west and the child in the background. There was no automatic need to create another emperor immediately. The fact that nearly 5 months passed before a new Eastern ruler was installed proves that the state could hesitate, debate, and seek a workable solution. Proposals that a child could simply be shipped east, with advisors to function as an Eastern emperor, belong to a later logic, one that would become thinkable only in subsequent decades. In the 300s and 70s, such an arrangement remained too novel, too risky, and too far from what people expected an emperor to be in a moment of existential military danger. In the end, a boy was not enough. The empire required a field commander with authority, experience, and the ability to organize recovery after catastrophe. Ironically, the solution demanded exactly the kind of figure that earlier palace politics in the West had tried to prevent from becoming emperor. A powerful general who could command loyalty on the strength of personal reputation rather than dynastic birth. Adrianople forced the system to accept that reality. Child emperor rule could serve dynastic continuity and internal bargaining, but it could not, by itself, answer a crisis that threatened the survival of the state. The aftermath also shifted the balance of influence at the Western court. The prominent tutor who had once helped define Gratian's public image and who had benefited from the early years of the reign was physically distant from the centre of decision-making when the empire faced its greatest emergency. The crucial months after the defeat were shaped in Illyricum, while the tutor remained at Trier. The young emperor had outgrown the role of promising student, praised for education and potential. The world had demanded a war leader, a crisis manager, and a politician capable of working with a new Eastern colleague while keeping his own court from splintering. From that point forward, the tone of Gratian's reign could no longer be set by flattering speeches or by the comforting idea of youthful promise. the empire had entered a harsher phase, and the experiment of child emperor rule would be judged not by ceremony, but by survival. After Adrianople, the eastern half of the empire needed more than a symbolic ruler. The new man elevated in the east faced an urgent assignment: rebuild shattered forces and stop the Gothic War from swallowing the Balkans. He was not a teenager raised in a palace. He was an experienced commander in his 30s, pulled into power when the Eastern throne had become a battlefield problem as much as a political one. That background mattered, because it shaped how he viewed the Western court. A young Western emperor might carry seniority on paper, but the new Eastern ruler had been chosen precisely because he could do what a younger colleague could not: restore military order. The quickest way to see the difference between the two courts is to watch how religion became policy. In the West, the early tone had leaned towards stability through tolerance, especially after the shock of Adrianople, when unity mattered more than doctrinal victory. In the East, the new emperor moved differently. Within a year of taking power, he declared that religious conformity would be enforced, and he defined that conformity in terms that aligned the East with the doctrinal position favoured in the West's leading churches. It was a dramatic opening statement, not only about belief, but about authority. A new regime needed an identity, and this was one of the clearest ways to claim it. Motives are always debated. Some see a ruler acting from personal conviction, shaped by upbringing and regional culture. Others point toward the long habits of army life under Nicene commanders, where loyalty, order, and a single standard could feel like virtues in themselves. There is also the local pressure of bishops and religious networks in the imperial cities, where the Eastern court was operating. A ruler who had just arrived, still building alliances, could be influenced by the men who already held crowds, pulpits, and urban prestige. Whatever the inner cause, the result was public and unmistakable. The East and West were no longer moving in the same religious rhythm. That contrast deepened when illness struck the new emperor and he sought baptism during recovery. In an age where survival could be read as a sign of heavenly favour, a public display of Christian commitment also worked as political messaging. It presented the ruler as protected, chosen, and restored for a purpose. In a system where legitimacy often rested on signs of divine support, recovery itself could be treated like a verdict from above. The rivalry between courts became harder to ignore when church councils entered the picture. The Western emperor announced plans for a broad council that would include bishops from both halves of the empire, a move that signaled cooperation and an attempt to manage disputes on an imperial scale. Yet before that Western meeting took shape, the Eastern emperor held his own council in the capital and gathered a large body of Eastern bishops there. Once the East had convened and spoken, the practical effect was simple. Eastern bishops did not travel west in meaningful numbers. The Western Council went ahead, but it was reduced in scope and forced to adjust its ambitions. Even if this outcome can be explained by distance, logistics, and slow communications, the optics were humiliating for the Western court. It made the Western emperor look as if his initiative could be ignored. And it hinted at something more. The Eastern ruler was building an independent religious policy, not merely continuing a shared program. A powerful bishop in Italy helped the Western court save face, but he also used the moment to push his own priorities. The end result was not harmony. It was a visible split in leadership, with each side acting as if it could define Christian order without the other. There were other points of friction too, including ceremonial precedents and the politics of honour. None of this proves that age alone caused the tension, but youth shaped perception. The Eastern ruler was older, battle-tested, and carrying the burdens of a frontier crisis. The Western ruler was in his early 20s, and his position depended heavily on inherited legitimacy and on the loyalty of generals, whose interests were not always the same as his own. In speeches aimed at Eastern audiences, court orators tried to smooth the contradiction by describing the older emperor as a kind of guiding father figure, and the younger as a wise chooser who recognized virtue rather than seniority. The language was flattering to both men, but it quietly changed the emotional hierarchy. The older ruler looked like the stabilizing center, even if the Western emperor still held formal seniority. A few years later, the tone shifted again. Western colleagues faded from Eastern ceremonial rhetoric, treated less as partners and more as background. The Western emperor's main role became a single act, announcing the elevation of the Eastern ruler, as if he were merely the messenger of a decision already made by heaven. Then came a decisive move. The Eastern emperor elevated his own young son as co-ruler. The message was unmistakable. The East was securing its future without asking permission. The Western emperor did not publicly endorse the promotion and did not celebrate it through the same channels that normally signaled unity. Relations did not grow warmer with time. They cooled. This mattered because it left the West exposed at the worst possible moment. In 383, the Western Empire faced a sudden break in military loyalty. In Britain, the commander of the island's troops was proclaimed emperor. He crossed to the continent and established himself in the north, creating a direct challenge to the Western ruler. The Western army confronted the usurper, and for several days the two forces tested each other. Then the decisive blow fell, not from an enemy spear, but from betrayal inside the Western command structure. A top general defected, and with him went most of the army. The Western emperor tried to flee, but he was hunted down and killed. Ancient narratives offered moral explanations. Some said the young ruler began with promise and then slid into indulgence. Others blamed advisors, suggesting that a ruler still young could be steered, corrupted, or distracted by the people closest to him. Those stories reflect a broader theme in late Roman politics: the fear that youth at the top could mean weakness in the centre, and weakness in the centre invited predators at the edge. The breakdown with the Eastern court did not cause the usurpation by itself, but it helped create the environment where the West stood alone. The Eastern emperor's independent religious initiatives, his disregard for Western ceremonial leadership, and his decision to secure the East with his own dynastic co-ruler, all signalled that Western authority had limits. At the same time, the Western emperor's real problem was closer to home. He failed to keep the army's loyalty when it mattered most. One revealing episode was his recruitment of foreign troops, especially Alans, and the special favour he showed them. Some sources frame this as the work of corrupt courtiers, but the choice also fits a political logic. A young ruler surrounded by entrenched military networks might try to create a personal guard that owed loyalty to him alone, not to the old commanders who had built influence under earlier reigns. A bodyguard of outsiders could be a tool of independence, yet it was also a provocation. Favouring new men in front of veteran units bred resentment, and resentment in an army is never a private emotion. It becomes a political force. This was the trap of the Western court. It was pulled between powerful Gallic military interests and new pressures emerging in Italy. When frontier instability forced the court to shift south, northern Italy became the new centre of gravity. That move opened the palace to different groups: Italian aristocrats, powerful church leaders, and intense urban lobbying. The court became more crowded, more complex, and more exposed to influence. But the move also created a sense of abandonment in Gaul, a region that had grown used to the presence of a campaigning emperor and the prestige that came with hosting the imperial machine. distance often creates opportunity. A usurper rising in the north could present himself not just as a challenger, but as the return of attention and power to a region that felt neglected. By the summer of 383, the Western Emperor's position depended on loyalty that he did not fully control. The army that should have protected him chose another man. The Eastern court did not rush to reinforce him, and the political experiment that began with child emperors, palaces, and carefully staged legitimacy ended, for him, in the oldest Roman verdict of all: the army's decision on the battlefield. The rise of Magnus Maximus exposed a widening gap between what the provinces and the army needed and what the imperial court looked like from the inside. The Western government still spoke the language of dynastic legitimacy and carefully managed image, but the troops were increasingly guided by immediate security, pay, and leadership they trusted in the field. A similar pattern had appeared a generation earlier when another commander toppled a young Western emperor during a moment of tension inside the imperial college. The conditions were familiar: a youthful ruler in the West, a difficult relationship with the East, and a military world willing to solve political problems with acclamation and force. The Eastern court's habit of treating the Western emperor as a junior partner made that pattern easier to repeat. If rule by minors was going to become normal, the empire faced a hard question. Could a young emperor, even after reaching adulthood, ever truly command an army dominated by powerful generals? And another question followed immediately in 383. After Gratian's fall, would the Eastern emperor choose to protect the Western throne, or allow it to fracture further? When Gratian was killed, the boy Valentinian II suddenly became, in theory, the senior legitimate ruler in the West. In practice, power clustered around whoever could organize courts, soldiers, and supply. Maximus did not rush straight into Italy. He held position in Gaul, settled into Trier, and presented himself as a stable successor, occupying the old seat of Western authority. That choice was not accidental. It was a claim of continuity, a way to calm local elites, and a message to the army that the new regime had roots. Meanwhile, what remained of the old government pulled together around Valentinian II in Milan. Building a loyalist court around a 12-year-old whose crown had become both a symbol of legitimacy and a reminder of weakness. Everyone at Milan looked east. They needed recognition, resources, and the threat of intervention. Yet the Eastern emperor moved cautiously. No clear evidence points to a secret pact between Maximus and the East. But many observers suspected sympathy, or at least patience, because Maximus and the Eastern ruler shared a similar background and military credibility. Still, it is hard to imagine the Eastern emperor welcoming a tougher Western colleague. The East had just begun building its own dynasty, and an ambitious soldier emperor in Gaul was the last kind of partner the East would want when its own position was still being secured. For several years, urgent Eastern problems competed for attention: border pressures, diplomacy, and new incursions that demanded troops and time. That reality helps explain why Maximus was not confronted immediately. But the loyalist circle around Valentinian II was not made up of nobodies. Senators, ministers, and church leaders had influence, and they worked to keep the Eastern emperor engaged. Messages of thanks, requests for aid, and public gestures of alliance appeared, all meant to pull the East closer to the survival of Milan. At the same time, the boy emperor's supporters tried to frame the Eastern ruler as a protective guardian, the steady adult presence above the fractured West. That framing served multiple purposes. It reassured wavering elites, warned Maximus that invasion would carry a price, and helped explain why a child still sat on the throne at all. Eventually, a compromise took shape. The usurper could be treated as a colleague in exchange for restraint. He would keep Gaul, while Italy, Africa, and the central provinces would remain with Valentinian II. The arrangement was uneasy, but it bought time and kept the East free to manage its own crises. That uneasy balance did not remove the central problem. Valentinian II's government survived because other people found it useful. For Maximus, the boy's existence was an obstacle, a living reminder that his own legitimacy was improvised. For Roman aristocrats, Milan mattered because proximity to an emperor, especially one who could be influenced, created access, favours, and leverage. For the Bishop of Milan, the court mattered because it was the arena where religious authority, doctrine, and imperial power collided. For the Eastern Emperor, a weak West had advantages. It could not threaten the East, and it could be made dependent, to be rescued or ignored as circumstances required. The religious situation made everything more dangerous. Maximus did not present himself only as a strong ruler. He positioned himself as a moral ruler, a champion of orthodoxy, and therefore a champion of legitimacy. That stance was aimed directly at the Milan court, which was associated with a controversial religious line and internal conflict with a powerful bishop. The usurper exploited the optics ruthlessly. Letters circulated in Italy that warned the boy emperor he was courting disaster, accusing the Milan court of offending God and endangering the church. It was propaganda with teeth. If the emperor's role included guarding true faith, then a ruler portrayed as doctrinally suspect could be portrayed as illegitimate, even if his opponent had risen through violence. At Milan, victories in the religious struggle amplified the bishop's authority and intensified the public mood. Signs, discoveries, and celebrations inside the city gave the impression that heaven itself had intervened on the side of Nicene believers. That atmosphere sharpened the contrast. The usurper could claim moral seriousness, the bishop could claim divine approval, and the child emperor's court looked cornered and exposed. In that climate, the bishop was asked to act as an envoy to the usurper. The decision reveals something essential about late Roman power. Ideology mattered, but access mattered more. Even those who disagreed with the court's religious stance could still choose to defend the dynasty, because the dynasty anchored the political world they depended on. A functioning imperial court in Italy meant appointments, influence, and a channel into government. Removing it would not simply replace one emperor, it would rearrange the entire system of patronage and control. The boy's youth also became a weapon. It could soften hostility, justify delays, and create a moral pressure that hard politics often lacked. Envoys could argue that a child and his mother could not make dangerous journeys, that winter crossings were unreasonable, that negotiations required patience. Those arguments were partly practical, partly theatrical, and entirely political. They slowed Maximus, but they could not stop him forever. In 387, the usurper finally moved. He broke through the Alpine routes and entered Italy. The invasion was swift and, by the standards of civil war, remarkably bloodless at first. The Milan court fled across the sea and sought refuge in Thessalonica. Maximus installed himself in Milan and began to build support in Rome through appointments and alliances. Prominent senators adjusted quickly. Some who had once supported Milan now praised the new master of Italy, not because they loved him, but because survival and influence required flexibility. Rome had always contained a class of political realists, and in a crisis they leaned toward the power that was nearest. Only now did the East fully turn its attention westward. With Eastern threats reduced and diplomacy stabilized, the Eastern Emperor could finally act. The meeting in Thessalonica became the turning point. A marriage tied the Eastern ruler to the Western dynasty, not as romance, but as strategy. It advertised legitimacy, unity, and a shared cause against an intruder. The displaced boy emperor was also pressed to align himself with orthodox belief, a move that strengthened the moral case for restoration and removed a vulnerability that Maximus had been exploiting. Then the counterattack began. The Eastern emperor marched with the field army while the Western court moved separately by sea. That separation had consequences. Even when victory came, the boy emperor could not claim it as a triumph of his own leadership. The decisive battles belonged to the Eastern commander. Maximus was defeated in the region of the Upper Danube, captured and executed. His attempt to found a dynasty ended as well. His young son, raised as a co-ruler in imitation of recent imperial patterns, was eliminated. The message was brutal but clear. Dynastic experiments were permitted when sanctioned by established power, not when created by rebellion. With Maximus gone, the Eastern Emperor entered Rome in 389 with a spectacular ceremonial arrival. The triumph celebrated restoration, but it also advertised a new hierarchy. The future of the empire was presented through the Eastern Emperor's children, not through Valentinian II. The restored Western Augustus was sidelined, kept away from the center of the celebration, and denied a public role that might have suggested equality. In the propaganda of victory, the Western ruler became a footnote, useful as a symbol, but not as a partner. After the war, the pattern continued. The Eastern Emperor stayed in Italy for years, governing from Milan as if the West were a province under supervision. Valentinian II was pushed to the margins, sent north into Gaul, and placed under the watch of a powerful Frankish general. The arrangement looked like protection, but it functioned like control. The Western Emperor's court became a controlled space, and his personal authority shrank further. The Eastern ruler also reshaped the Western administration. Some key offices went to men from the East, creating a chain of dependence. At the same time, the Eastern court worked to win over influential Western figures, senators, former loyalists, and generals, by offering pardons, prestige, and appointments. Men who had once clustered around the boy emperor adapted again, now attaching themselves to the victor who could grant real favors. The Eastern emperor understood the social machinery of the West. Rome wanted attention, the aristocracy wanted security, and everyone wanted a path back into imperial favor after having bet on the wrong horse. Even religion, which had served as a weapon during the crisis, was handled with pragmatism in these years. The Eastern Emperor offered reconciliation and honors broadly, even to prominent pagans who could stabilize Italy and Rome. The message was not softness, it was control through inclusion. A Western elite that felt seen and rewarded was less likely to resist the new order. By the time the Eastern Emperor returned to the capital in 391, the imbalance was obvious. Westerners even followed him east to take office, chasing the true center of power. Valentinian II remained in the West, but increasingly as a supervised figure rather than an independent ruler. The impression left to contemporaries was stark. There was one fully empowered emperor, and around him a ring of junior Augusti, his own sons foremost, while the restored Western Augustus stood isolated, watched, and replaceable. In Gaul, the young Western emperor still tried to act as an emperor where he could. Petitions arrived, including renewed attempts by senators to regain old privileges. The moment looked tempting. If the East had departed, perhaps influence could be rebuilt through the local court again. But by this stage, the Western emperor's religious posture had become one of the few tools left to prove legitimacy. After being restored on conditions that included public orthodoxy, visible piety became a form of political armour. He could concede little because concessions would reopen the same vulnerability that Maximus had exploited before. Stories from the period paint a bleak picture of how little freedom Valentinian II had left in Gaul. Arbogast, the powerful Frankish general placed beside him, appears in multiple accounts as the real force in the palace. Some reports describe advisors being removed violently inside the imperial residence. Others tell of the young emperor trying to dismiss the general, only to watch the order ripped apart in front of him, followed by a blunt reminder. The one who did not appoint a commander could not remove him. Whether every detail is accurate or not, the overall impression is consistent. The Western court had become a stage where a teenager wore the crown, while an adult soldier controlled the doors, the staff, and the decisions. That arrangement depended on something the empire had learned the hard way. In late Roman politics, authority was not only a title, it was presence. An emperor needed to be seen distributing favours, confirming appointments, rewarding units, and calming rivalries inside the bureaucracy and the army. When the Eastern Emperor returned to the capital and tried to manage the West from a distance, the plan began to unravel. The imperial office had been divided partly because the system required a ruler on the spot, not a remote supervisor sending orders across long distances. There was another problem as well. By restricting Valentinian II to Gaul, the new order weakened Italy militarily. In the first months of 392, raiders were reported in the Alpine region. People in northern Italy began asking an uncomfortable question. Who, exactly, was supposed to defend them? The nearest troops were not in Italy. They were with Arbogast, and with the emperor he effectively managed, far away at Vienne. A court that had once been the centre of Western power now looked like a city waiting for help that might not arrive. Milan turned to Ambrose. The bishop was asked to lead a mission to Gaul and request assistance. According to his own later account, Valentinian II was already eager to act before the appeal had even fully taken shape. Ambrose hesitated, partly because reports were circulating that the emperor was already on the move, and that imperial insignia had arrived ahead of him, as if his appearance were imminent. But hesitation could also reflect political danger. If the young emperor suddenly took the field, leading troops in response to an emergency, it would create exactly the kind of public independence that could irritate the Eastern court. The situation was delicate. Helping the West defend itself could look like defying the structure that had been imposed after the fall of Maximus. Whatever the bishop's doubts, the young emperor's own messages suggest mounting desperation. Arbogast appears to have blocked him from leaving. Valentinian II pressed Ambrose to come anyway, adding a request no bishop could easily refuse. He asked to receive baptism from Ambrose himself. Then came the most revealing detail. The emperor also asked Ambrose to mediate between him and Arbogast. That request makes one thing plain. The relationship between the crowned ruler and the man running the palace was collapsing. Some sources also suggest that appeals were sent eastward, begging the senior emperor to intervene against Arbogast's dominance. Ambrose began the journey. Then, midway across the Alps, news reached him that the emperor was dead. Valentinian II was found hanged in his quarters at Vienne on May 15th, 392. From the beginning, the circumstances were disputed. Some believed murder, others believed suicide. The public uncertainty never disappeared, partly because Ambrose himself, in speaking publicly after the death, refused to pronounce on what had happened. Silence can be read in more than one way. In this case, it helped suspicion breathe. The argument for assassination often rests on claims that Arbogast and a court intellectual named Eugenius worked together to remove the emperor and replace him. But there is a serious complication. There was a long pause before any new Western ruler was formally proclaimed. Eugenius was not elevated until late August 392, around 3 months after Valentinian's death. That delay does not fit neatly with the picture of a swift, pre-planned replacement. It suggests a different scenario. Either Arbogast did not have a ready candidate, or he expected the Eastern Emperor to decide what would happen next, or he feared the political risk of moving too quickly. In reality, Valentinian's death placed Arbogast in a dangerous position. A powerful general could dominate a living emperor, but a dead emperor created a vacuum, and vacuums invite blame. Arbogast appears to have waited for the East to respond. When nothing decisive happened, he moved toward open rebellion, accepting that suspicion would fall on him no matter what he claimed. The proclamation of Eugenius turned private control into public defiance. The Eastern court answered with its own dynastic move. In January 393, the senior emperor elevated his young son Honorius as co-ruler. The message was unmistakable. The future belonged to the Eastern household. Then came war. In September 394, the Eastern army marched west again and crushed Eugenius at the Battle of the Frigidus. A few months later, the Eastern emperor died as well, leaving the empire to 2 sons, Arcadius, already an adult, and Honorius, still a boy. Looking back, it is hard to imagine contemporaries calling the reigns of Gratian and Valentinian II a success in the traditional Roman sense. The old expectations were harsh. Legitimacy did not rest only on birth or ceremonial acclamation. It also rested on how a ruler came to power, whether his reign looked blessed by success, and what people said about him after death. By those standards, both Western rulers faced an uphill climb from the start. Their early elevations were shaped by crisis and faction, and their later reigns were marked by court rivalry, military insecurity, and dependence on stronger figures. The added weight of Eastern politics made the Western position worse. Adult colleagues in the East repeatedly projected themselves as the senior members of the imperial college, even when formal seniority was unclear or contested. That posture made the Western emperors look like juniors. It also encouraged the sense that they could be bypassed, managed, or replaced. Isolation followed, then vulnerability, and opportunists exploited it. When writers of the age described these young rulers, the tone often turned toward pity more than endorsement. Gratian appears in many accounts as a promising youth who drifted under pressure and bad advice, abandoned by soldiers and betrayed by circumstance. Valentinian II appears as a tragic figure, hemmed in by stronger men, admired for youth and potential, and mourned as someone never allowed to become what an emperor was supposed to be. Against that bleak portrait stood the triumphant image of Theodosius, the victorious rescuer, the avenger, the restorer. Public celebration in the late empire favoured winners. Victory looked like divine approval. The man who marched into Rome in triumph could eclipse those who had worn crowns but lacked power. And yet, the importance of Gratian and Valentinian II lies not only in their failures. Their accessions marked a turning point. An 8-year-old raised as full Augustus. A 4-year-old proclaimed in a military emergency. These were not minor adjustments. They were innovations that reshaped what was politically imaginable. They opened a path that later rulers and power brokers would use again and again. The child emperor as a legitimate symbol, and the adult general or minister as the operator behind the symbol. It is easy to describe these accessions as experiments, but the people involved probably did not think of themselves as testing a theory. They were responding to immediate fear. Illness, sudden death, a dangerous army, and the constant threat of usurpation. Yet, whatever the intentions, the results mattered. A child raised as Augustus became a precedent. Once that precedent existed, it could be repeated by ambitious courtiers, by generals seeking safe legitimacy, and by emperors building dynasties. Even so, the two half-brothers were not identical cases. Gratian's early years unfolded under the protection of a powerful father. He inherited an established court, a trained administrative machine, and a ready-made support base. Although some of that inheritance had to be reshaped quickly after 375 to calm senatorial anger. Valentinian II, by contrast, entered public life as a spare part, elevated as a tool in a crisis rather than as the expected heir. When the spotlight returned in 383, he was still only 12, and many of the best military assets in the West had already shifted toward a rival. Gratian began his independent reign with advantages and promise. Yet over 8 years his position decayed until it collapsed. Valentinian II began with almost nothing, and after 383 there was, in theory, everything to gain. A court to strengthen, alliances to forge, an usurper to resist, a future to claim. But he never truly received the freedom to attempt that transformation. The interests around him, senators seeking access, generals seeking control, an Eastern emperor seeking dominance, kept him boxed in, even as he grew older. Even if a child on the throne could be made to look convincing in public, the politics around these reigns exposed a stubborn set of weaknesses. The rise of both Gratian and Valentinian II was never only about family succession or public ceremony. Each elevation happened because it served the interests of specific groups at specific moments. In Gratian's case, the earliest promotion was driven from above by a father who wanted to lock the dynasty in place while he still lived. After the father died, the balance shifted. A circle of senior figures, military commanders, high officials, and influential aristocrats, began shaping what the new reign would look like. Some acted as power brokers in public, presenting harmony and continuity. Others operated behind the scenes, managing rivalries and removing obstacles. The key problem was that this kind of support was not a solid foundation. It was conditional. It lasted only as long as it remained useful. The moment a powerful commander judged the situation better, served elsewhere, loyalty could evaporate overnight. Gratian's fall showed that brutally. One day, a regime looked stable. The next day, an essential general defected, and the emperor was left exposed. A boy raised within the structure of legitimacy still needed the most basic ingredient of survival, an army that would stand with him. Valentinian II's first elevation was even more revealing. He was not promoted because anyone believed a small child could govern. He was promoted because a child could be used. A young, legitimate figure could pressure an older brother, soften rival claims, and give ambitious men leverage without granting them the risks that came with taking the throne themselves. Once those objectives were achieved, the child could be ignored. When the crisis passed, the same people who'd insisted on his importance could step away and concentrate on the older emperor. Years later, when the West cracked open again under a usurper, they returned, because the child emperor once more became politically valuable as a symbol. Another weakness also shows up clearly. Regimes like this were built on alliances, favours, and appointments. That required constant attention to patronage. Who received office, who received command, who received money, who received honour, and who felt excluded. The court needed to hold together not just senators and ministers, but soldiers and generals. In these early child emperor reigns, that balancing act often failed. Rival interests were managed poorly, and decisions that pleased one group inflamed another. The throne became a tool in a tug of war rather than a stable center of command. Over time, the committee style of control tended to give way to something even more stark: the dominance of a single military manager. This development answered one immediate problem, because the empire needed a decisive hand in the army. But it also created a new danger. If one commander became the real operator, then the emperor's military role, the traditional heart of imperial authority, could shrink into a performance. The question was no longer only how to protect a young emperor. It was whether such a system could survive for decades without collapsing into resentment, coups, or civil war. The aftermath of Adrianople made the issue impossible to ignore. In the eyes of many, the crisis demanded a proven adult commander. The choice of Theodosius underscored what anxious observers already suspected. A youthful emperor, even if legitimate, could be seen as insufficient when the frontiers were burning. And once an adult soldier emperor stepped into the spotlight, the child emperor model looked weaker, not stronger. The rise of Magnus Maximus delivered another lesson. His rebellion was not just a palace drama. It reflected broader dissatisfaction far from the court. It showed that legitimacy alone could not hold provinces and armies together if they felt ignored or mismanaged. Maximus also proved something else. A usurper could maintain power for years, bargain for recognition, and force compromises. That made it harder for a purely ceremonial emperor to appear viable, because a rival with an army could claim that he, not the boy in a palace, was the real protector of the state. Valentinian II's experience drove the point home. When Maximus advanced, the young emperor could not stop him. Rescue came from outside, and the restoration that followed only emphasized how dependent the Western throne had become. The government around Valentinian II survived only as long as it served the calculations of stronger figures. When those calculations changed, the boy emperor could be sidelined without apology, especially once Theodosius began presenting his own sons as the future of the empire. The same system that made weak emperors attractive to power brokers also made those emperors disposable. And yet, the story does not end with failure. The child emperor did not disappear from Roman politics. It evolved. The very ruler who had highlighted the limits of youthful emperorship also promoted his own children, showing how quickly this practice could shift from emergency improvisation to planned dynastic strategy. That leads into a different question. Less about coups and battles, more about image and belief. What did people expect an emperor to be, and how could a child be made to look like he matched that ideal? Public culture in the late empire carried a clear template of imperial excellence. It valued pedigree, physical presence, education, moral discipline, and, above all, military authority. A child could not easily command armies, but some parts of the ideal were easier to claim. On background alone, both Gratian and Valentinian II could be presented favourably. They were sons of an emperor, and that mattered. Their dynasty was not ancient, and critics could point out that it did not rest on a long aristocratic lineage. That vulnerability explains why official messaging often emphasized family honor and military merit, as if to say, even if the bloodline is recent, it has earned its place. Dynastic ties could also be strengthened through marriage and careful presentation. Linking the ruling household to older, respected imperial families gave extra shine to the throne and made the succession look less like a temporary arrangement and more like history, continuing along a familiar path. Personal presence mattered too. When rulers were praised in public, the language often lingered on appearance: eyes, composure, charm, the aura of authority. In this kind of writing, the point was not to provide a realistic portrait. The point was to reassure audiences that the emperor looked like an emperor, even if he was young. education became an especially useful weapon in the propaganda of youth. A boy who could not yet lead armies could still be presented as disciplined, eloquent, trained in moral judgment, and capable of learning statecraft. Gratian, in particular, benefited from this. He had a famous tutor, a celebrated teacher drawn into the court to shape him into a polished ruler. The tutor's praise, of course, cannot be treated as neutral. This was a political environment where public words served careers. But accuracy was not the main goal. The goal was to create a believable image, a young ruler formed by elite learning, able to speak well, judge fairly, and stand among aristocrats as an equal. This emphasis also reflected a deeper anxiety. A military emperor might win battles, but the court needed to deal with powerful senatorial circles, who valued culture, education, and the language of refinement. A highly schooled heir was one way to bridge that gap. It signalled that the dynasty could command not only soldiers, but also respect among the educated elite. Valentinian II's education is harder to trace clearly, but the logic of the system suggests the same approach would have been applied. A child on the throne needed every available advantage in presentation. Training him as a proper gentleman and advertising that training helped compensate for what he could not yet do in the field. Still, the hardest part of the imperial ideal remained the military function. Traditional expectations did not treat command as optional. The emperor was supposed to be the protector of the frontiers, the leader of armies, the face of victory. A child could not convincingly perform that role for long. And when Gratian became old enough to act, he did not inherit a long-standing model of passive emperorship to follow. Recent memory celebrated active rulers, men who campaigned, punished invaders, and proved themselves among troops. So once he was no longer a child, it was natural that he would try to step into that active role, not shrink from it. Late Roman political culture did not judge emperors only by battlefield victories or clever laws. Public expectations reached into private conduct. The ideal ruler was supposed to be visibly disciplined, measured, and in control of himself. Wisdom mattered. Restraint mattered. Temper was supposed to be steady. Appetite was supposed to be limited. Even personal relationships, even leisure, were treated as political evidence. For a young emperor especially, the smallest rumour could become a verdict. That is why so much surviving praise for Gratian leans heavily on character rather than achievements. Court voices depicted him as naturally gentle, thoughtful beyond his years, and unusually generous. He was described as the kind of person who could sense what people needed, before they asked, the kind of emperor whose kindness arrived first and whose punishment arrived last. His private life was presented as almost spotless. He ate and drank with moderation. He carried himself with a quiet modesty that some observers even considered excessive, as if caution had gone too far and weakened the state. Yet the image was never stable. Not everyone accepted the same portrait. Another strand of commentary implies that the palace kept the real Gratian hidden behind curtains, that stories about him changed depending on who was speaking, and that even contemporaries were unsure what kind of man he truly was. A more nuanced picture appears in writers who tried to hold two ideas together at once. The young emperor might have had real ability and real self-control, but he was surrounded by people who were hungry for influence and who steered him toward distractions. In that version, the tragedy is not that he had no virtues, but that those virtues were not protected, not reinforced, not allowed to mature into something unshakable. Valentinian II, as he appears in later praise, is framed even more strongly through the lens of moral discipline. The language attached to him turns repeatedly toward duty over pleasure. He is described as someone who held himself back from entertainments that might make him look frivolous. Even public spectacles that were normal for imperial life are presented as things he avoided, for fear that anyone would say his attention had drifted from government. He is portrayed as almost theatrical in his restraint, fasting to extremes, acting as if self-denial itself was a public statement. Stories even circulate about him demonstrating his self-control in front of others, as though virtue needed witnesses in order to count. It is hard to miss what is happening here. When an emperor is young and has little record of dramatic action, rhetoric finds other ways to fill the space. If victories are few, then virtue becomes the victory. If the ruler cannot easily be praised for conquering enemies, he can be praised for conquering himself. In that sense, the emphasis placed on Valentinian's moral rigor reflects an adjustment in what an imperial success story could look like when the person wearing the purple was still barely an adult. It also hints at a broader trend. In later Western reigns, especially those dominated by minority governments, spiritual worth and visible piety would become more central to the way legitimacy was sold to elites and crowds alike. Of course, none of this proves that the young rulers truly lived the way the speeches claim. One set of praises was delivered while Gratian was still alive and still politically useful. Another set was delivered over a dead boy whose death was politically dangerous, to discuss honestly. Both situations encourage idealization. But the purpose of these portraits was not to give modern readers reliable biographies. Their value lies in something else. They show what the court wanted audiences to believe, what qualities were considered worth advertising, and which groups were being targeted by that advertising. The emperor's image was being presented to people whose support mattered: senior officers, high officials, and the social elites who could either stabilize a reign or quietly withdraw their loyalty. Even if a young emperor could be packaged as wise and self-controlled, the job demanded more than a polished image. Late Roman ideas of rulership also insisted on practical competence. The emperor was expected not only to look virtuous, but to operate the machinery of power, especially in war. And war was the arena that most easily exposed the limits of a child on the throne. Public praise again tries to bridge the gap. Writers describe Gratian as energetic, physically capable, and skilled in the habits that marked a military ruler. He is praised as athletic, quick, durable, and comfortable in hardship. He is portrayed as an excellent horseman and a strong archer, someone who could run with soldiers, train like soldiers, and endure the same harsh conditions. This kind of description follows a well-worn template: the emperor who suffers cold, thirst, and sleeplessness alongside his men. The emperor who stays close to the standards and shares danger rather than delegating it. There is an important shift here. When a very young emperor is proclaimed, the praise cannot be built on a long list of campaigns. Instead, it leans on promise. The speeches speak as if future victories are already present, as if the child's character is a guarantee of what he will one day do. That is a way of creating confidence when the evidence does not yet exist. Earlier, panegyrics could point to feats and then claim that those feats had been visible in childhood. With child rulers, the order is reversed. The promise comes first, and everyone is asked to believe that fulfillment will follow. How far did Gratian actually get toward becoming that kind of military emperor? The record suggests a mixed reality. As a child, he appeared on campaign because his presence served as symbol and ceremony, not because he could command. Even as a teenager, he was sometimes kept away from active operations, perhaps for safety, perhaps for politics, perhaps to mark a transition into a more independent public role. But there is at least one moment when he did step directly into military action, and was praised for it. During a campaign in the late 370s, he is described as personally courageous, visible near the front, encouraging the troops by example, and pressing a small enemy group until it collapsed. That episode matters because it shows potential. The young emperor could perform the role when circumstances allowed. Yet the deeper pattern of the reign points in the other direction. The Western army was not truly his. The strongest officer in the West held influence that limited what the emperor could order and what he could enforce. Requests for military support, movement of troops, and decisions about where the army would fight did not consistently reflect the emperor's will. There are moments where troops sent to help elsewhere simply did not go, and where powerful commanders faced no consequences. In practical terms, this means the emperor's military authority was contested inside his own system. A young ruler could win a skirmish and still lack command over the structure that decided wars. After Adrianople, that weakness became painfully visible. The crisis was large enough that the system demanded an adult soldier emperor, not merely a legitimate youth. The appointment of a new Eastern ruler, whatever the exact politics behind it, signalled a lack of confidence that the surviving emperors could handle the emergency alone. Territory and resources that had belonged to the Western sphere were shifted in order to supply the war effort. The Eastern army had to be rebuilt. Meetings were held. Generals moved. Retreats were forced. Negotiations eventually produced a settlement. Throughout those years, the decisive actors appear again and again as senior officers, not as the Western emperors themselves. The war was fought in their names, but the centre of gravity lay elsewhere. The rhetoric continued to insist that Gratian loved his soldiers and that his soldiers loved him. But later events suggest that whatever affection existed was not enough. He attempted to reshape loyalties by bringing in new forces and rewarding them. That may have been an effort to weaken the dominance of entrenched commanders and build a personal following. It also risked alienating the established army. In the end, the most powerful general in his service switched sides during a rebellion, and large parts of the Western military went with him. That kind of mass defection does not happen when a ruler is perceived as the unquestioned leader of the army. It suggests that the emperor's military image had not become a lived reality. Valentinian II, by contrast, is almost absent from military history. That absence is itself revealing. He spent years first under his brother's shadow and then under a stronger colleague's shadow. When the empire returned him to the West after a civil war, he did not receive the full stage. The victory was presented as another man's victory. The young emperor was protected, positioned, moved across the map when convenient, and watched closely by a commander who held the soldiers' loyalty. When threats appeared in northern Italy, the emperor's desire to act could be blocked by the very military system that claimed to serve him. The result was a ruler with a title, but without the one function that traditionally anchored the title. If the battlefield exposed the limits of youthful emperorship, the courtroom and the government office posed a different question. The emperor was expected to be the ultimate judge and the ultimate source of law. In theory, he was the living embodiment of justice. Speeches, therefore, praised both brothers as fair, approachable, and merciful. They were said to welcome petitions, reject malicious informers, and show restraint in punishment. They were described as respectful toward elites and careful in counsel. Yet again, there are hints of another reality, that access and favours could be bought, that a few men around the throne could dominate appointments, and that official decisions could be shaped by greed and influence. Those claims may also be exaggerated, but they reflect a widespread fear in late imperial politics, that the emperor could become the front for other people's power. Here, the structure of the late Roman state becomes crucial. By the late 4th century, government had become more centralized, more procedural, and far larger than it had once been. senior civil officials held wide responsibilities, and the machinery of administration produced an enormous volume of paperwork, appeals, and decisions. That growth had two consequences at once. On one hand, it made the centre stronger, because it could reach farther into provincial life. On the other hand, it made the emperor more dependent on trained administrators, because no single person could personally manage the full load. This professionalization changed what it meant to rule. Departments could continue operating because career officials stayed in place even when leadership at the top changed. Systems and routines outlived individuals. In such an environment, the personal competence of the emperors mattered less day to day than it once had. That is what made a child emperor possible in the first place. A child did not need to master every law or understand every file. He needed a court that could put documents in front of him, explain the required decision, and obtain his approval. This does not mean the emperor became irrelevant. The emperor still mattered enormously in appointments, in patronage, in the symbolism of authority, and in moments of crisis. But it does mean that the government could function, at least superficially, with an emperor who was not yet capable of independent judgment in every area. The state had evolved into something that could run, for a time, with an inexperienced figure at the top. The surviving laws from these reigns show ordinary imperial concerns: court procedure, military discipline, ranks, local duties, and the management of imperial personnel. Yet the record also suggests that the young Western court did not consistently produce a strong legislative footprint, especially in later years. That could reflect loss of capacity or later editorial choices about what was worth preserving, or simply the fact that stronger emperors cast longer shadows in the archival tradition. Whatever the explanation, it affected perception. When one ruler continued issuing laws steadily, while another appeared silent, contemporaries could easily conclude that only one of them truly governed.